We very rarely talk about editing, and yet editing is such an important part and process of investigative reporting and investigative journalism. And over the past decade, it has definitely got more complicated and more complex. And I think we've all felt that we tend to throw people into the role without giving them much instruction, just get on with it. So what we hope to do today is just talk through some of the things that we think, from our experience, are relevant pointers to people editing or moving into the editing role. We're not just going to talk about the narrative and the narrative arc and making stories land, even though that is incredibly important, and we are going to touch on that, but we're going to touch on the wider aspect of being an editor in investigative journalism and talk about keeping our reporters safe in these difficult times, both from legal threats, from security threats, from state actors, etc., keeping their sources safe. Keeping our reporters from going down rabbit holes, keeping them focused even when they're trying to look at huge amounts of data. Finding the stories, making sure we're working alongside them, being a friend, being a frenemy, all of these tips that we want to talk about when you approach a project, and finally the copy that you have to deal with. And we're also not just going to talk about written, we're going to talk about different platforms. And somehow, we're going to try and fit that into about 30 to 40 minutes, because I want to bring some energy into the room and get you guys working hard to give you the opportunity to ask questions and make our jobs a little bit easier on this last day of conference. So get ready for your questions. First of all, I'm going to hand over to the panel. I've asked them to give their tips for about 8 minutes with a few slides just to help people who don't speak English as their first language. So I'm going to hand over first to Drew, who's going to give us the overview.
Great, thanks, Rachel. So welcome. One of the reasons I came up with this panel was because I have 65 investigative editors working under our editor-in-chief. It's an incredibly large number of people, and it's a very difficult job. And of course, we just throw people into jobs and say, you're an investigative editor now, go create investigative stories. And what makes a good investigator is not necessarily what makes a good investigative editor. And so I want to talk a little bit about the difference there. So do I have the slide thing? Oh, it's over here.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Waiting for that slide to change. It isn't changing. So this is what I consider the tasks of an investigative editor. Basically, it is your job to, when a reporter pitches a story, to identify the good stories or to shape the stories into good stories. That's a critical step. Reporters don't always, we have a lot of reporters who just can't see a story to save their lives. You also have to chart the investigative plan going forward. You have to keep the story focused at all times. You have to make the investigative process efficient. And if there's one thing I will say in this panel, it's kind of one of these Buddhist things that it's really simple, but if you think about it, it's actually quite complex. Investigative reporting is about efficiency. It really is about efficiency. It's putting out more stories that will have more impact in a quicker period of time. You can spend 2 years on a story, or you can spend 2 months on a story. And the difference between a reporter who can do that same story in 2 months and 2 years is the difference between either making money or not making money, getting grants or not getting grants. It's hugely important. And the great investigative teams are built through great investigative reporters that are incredibly well edited. If you look at the great, there was an editor for the Philadelphia Inquirer for years, Gene Roberts. And Gene Roberts won 17 Pulitzer Prizes with the Philadelphia Inquirer. He then went to the New York Times, and they didn't win another Pulitzer Prize for another 6 years. When he went to the New York Times, they immediately won 2. Dave Boardman of the Seattle Times won Pulitzer after Pulitzer, and then he left, and they didn't win another one. And so really it is about the investigative editor making a reporter incredibly efficient and incredibly good. Commonly nowadays, we have to also worry about security concerns, and then you have to make sure that obviously you set the standards for an organization. An organization changes overnight because of its investigative editor. The standards change, the quality changes, everything. It all goes through you. You set that standard. and of course, motivating reporters. So my philosophy on this is, my job is to make a reporter great. You know, you are a success when your reporter is a success. So I want a dozen people on my team that people say, oh man, those are great reporters. That means I've been successful. I have to pull this out of them. You are not allowed an ego. You have to basically be the motivator. You lead from behind, not from ahead. We're dealing with people who are basically artists, you know, craftspersons. That's what a great investigative reporter is. And you don't motivate them by yelling at them and by dictating. You motivate them, you make them happy, you make them interested, you make them willing to work hard on something. So you're not really a boss, you are a mentor. You treat everybody differently. You don't use the same thing with everybody. Every reporter is different. What motivates them is different. You know, you have to understand them and you have to treat them differently, even though other people gripe at you because you do that. And then, of course, you're there to take the blame. Everything that bad happens, you take the blame. You shield your reporters. You protect them from the upper level management. When there's an organized crime figure, they say, oh, you know, it's not me doing the story, it's my editor. Go talk to him. You know, I take all the blame for everything so that I can keep the reporter safe, so I can keep the reporter sheltered, and they can focus on what they need to do, which is creating that masterpiece. And then when it's all done, you give all the credit away to the reporter. You tell them they're amazing, you tell them they're great, and you let them go up on stage and accept the award. You stay out of it because that's what's motivating them, okay? And then finally, you have to recognize, commonly now, burnout, unfortunately, which is a serious problem in our industry. So you have to recognize burnout, you have to recognize danger, and other problems. So what makes a good story? Well, I think most of you know what makes a good story, so I'll throw these up there very quickly, and you can read. A lot of reporters don't see good stories, and especially when you're working across cultures and when you're working across collaborative projects, it's often a quite different idea of what makes a story in different cultures. And so you need to kind of remedy that, and you need to figure out and balance that and come to a compromise. You also need to chart the good investigative plan. And I do this by what I call critical information on a story. Critical information is the information needed to prove a story. And this is about, again, about efficiency. How you prove that critical information dictates what you can say in a story and how strongly you can tell that story. But what happens is reporters who are unsure of themselves or are new or are just not very careful will go out and report across. They'll go interview people, they'll do all sorts of stuff, and they'll waste a lot of time. And in the end, you work 6 months and you have to kill a story. You can't do that as an investigative organization. So what you have to do is force them to prove the information that meets the minimum story and do nothing else before that. And then once they meet that critical information for story, then you allow them to go interview and to collect the color and figure out what else is necessary, what characters, what narrative arc. But it has to be a really disciplined approach, and you are the one that dictates that. You are the one that makes sure that's being followed by asking the question every day, you know, have you proven that information? And what I do is every time I meet a reporter, I do a couple things. First, I say, what's the lead and thesis of the story? I make them repeat that every single time I meet with them, because that's part of the focus process. You want them to focus. That lead and thesis will change as you go along. But the other thing that it does, and what's really important, is reporters think by talking. And so you are there to listen to them talk. Sometimes for hours is necessary. It's really boring sometimes. But you really got to listen and then prompt them with stuff, because that's where they learn. That's where they understand their story, is by talking to you. You know, so you have to be incredibly patient. You can't be too busy, and you have to listen to them talk about their story. And in that process, they'll figure out really what they're doing. And you can prompt them, and maybe you'll figure it out first, and you can prompt them with it. But the important thing is that you're constantly looking at how that story is focusing and congealing around kind of the core thing that's going to be the great investigative story. And then, of course, you ask them every day, what are you going to do today? And at the end of the day, what did you do today? What are you going to do tomorrow? And that continuous process is not because you want to know, it's you want them to think. You want them to be constantly understanding what it is that they're going to be doing. And the other thing, this process, what you're going to look for is the spinning wheel. Reporters will spend an incredible amount of time going down some rabbit hole, and you've got to stop that. You've got to identify the rabbit holes quickly and say, well, let's spend 2 more days on that, but after that, let's move on. So that again, efficiency, guiding them, directing them, everything, you're kind of sucking everything in, pulling it around that story. And then you need to be the adult in the room and make the decision, hey, this isn't working. We're spending too much time on this, and the result is not good enough. I have to do a certain amount with every penny that a donor gives me. So I have a certain expectation of what stories come out and how often they come out. And so it's really important that when you're wasting time, you don't keep throwing good money after bad money, you kill the story. And that's the hardest thing to do after somebody spent a couple months doing it. If they spent 8 months doing it, you failed. Okay. Finally, we need to identify security concerns. The way we do it at OCCRP is the editor is responsible for safety. The reason why is the reporter can't be responsible for their own safety. They don't have the separation to make the difficult decisions that they need to do. So you want to put it in the hands of somebody else. So you have to learn to identify when there's a safety concern, and you do that by asking questions constantly. Is this guy dangerous? What's he done before? Has he killed before? How is he killed? Why is he killed? When is he killed? These types of things, you don't know. Let's do some reporting to figure out if this guy is dangerous. And you have to be asking those questions constantly. Journalists avoid concerns about safety because it's a scary thing. It just there's a kind of a separation in their mind. And then no journalist thinks they're going to be killed either. And so consequently, they don't want to deal with it. So you have to deal with it. So you take over the journalism decisions, you make the decisions, you make the plans, you have security meetings, you set up protocols for that reporter. You don't talk to this person. We're not going to talk to this person until the end. We're going to talk to his lawyer. We're not going to talk to him. Those kind of decisions, have to be made in kind of meetings where you go over protocols. And what we ultimately do is we say, if a journalist dies, we're going to look at your actions as an editor to make sure you did everything safe. It is your responsibility to keep your journalist alive. That's the only way for the editors to take it as seriously as we do at OCCRP. Because this is we don't know where there's danger, and we don't know what we don't know, and that takes somebody separate from the process to be looking at it and seeing where the black holes are and shining the light into those to figure out what's going on. So it's very quickly an outline
Brilliant.
of an investigative editor.
Almost stuck to 8 minutes too. Well done. And I now want to come and work for Drew. Brilliant.
I think I have the next set of slides. Okay, yeah. I come from Mexico. Quinto Elemento Lab is an investigative nonprofit organization. What we do is we try to boost the abilities of reporters around the country to conduct investigative reporting, and we do this by incubating their projects, by promoting collaborative work in newsrooms. And as I've been an investigative reporter for many years, and as many others in Mexico and Latin America at least, I was an editor orphan. The reason we created Quinto Elemento is because we wanted to change this. We wanted to have reporters have editors. And among other things, we are becoming a team of editors. We're training ourselves, and we also are training other reporters. We have Master Lab, which has trained in 3 years 66 reporters from areas in Mexico, Brazil, and El Salvador, where reporting is very, very difficult, and either for lack of independence or insecurity. And we're promoting the leadership of female editors in newsrooms, which is male-dominated, at least in my region. Well, I think I have a couple of, there's one aspect of editing that is very boring, but is very important in the final success of the reporting process and the resulting stories, which is organization. It is absolutely boring, but it's something reporters dismiss. I've been a reporter so long, and I hated doing chronologies, and I hated doing all these memos and things. But somehow I've learned that now that I'm on this side, how important that is. On the one hand, to the aspect of writing as I report, of organizing my material and rereading the records and the interview notes as I collect them, as I gather I do the news gathering, and how this is so important for the editors on the other side, so that they are on board of the story. They know a sufficient detail as to make intelligent questions, conduct interesting conversations with me, and make me see what I'm the blind spots. So organization has, I think, one of the important aspects of the things that an editor has to pursue in the relationship with reporters. At the very beginning when I started being an editor, I said, well, each reporter has a system, so I'm not going to tell them what to do. But I very soon discovered that they didn't have a system. They just, the system would just let, the notepads pile in desks and recordings that were never transcribed, and we don't have a month to write. You've been reporting 2 weeks or 1 week or 1 month for a story, and you have an evening to write the story. So the lack of organization puts us in such a hard trouble. A friend of mine told me one time that investigations leave scars. And I think organizing the material makes, in the end, the whole process less painful and less harmful. So there's a couple of things that I feel are very important. As Drew said, the idea of working with pitches, working with hypotheses, to being in agreement of what the focus of the story is, what your hypothesis is. Considering this as something that moves, that will change. I have my reporters have it in writing, like in their computers, like cardboard. You want to see like a mantra. You want to remember it every time you're at your desk. Before going out, when we start a story, we've done enough pre-reporting to know that there is a story, or that there is a story we can very probably corroborate and bring to life. So what we do is we determine, well, what is that set of evidence that we need to have in order to have this story? What is, as you said, what is the main things I have to, and which is the simpler route to get them? And the reason I think this is crucial in the conversations with reporters is it happens to us like when we Google. You start looking for a record and you end up in Facebook. It's like our minds tend to divert, and sometimes we're not very logical when we think of ways and the routes to finding the evidence. So at the very beginning, we do a sort of a we pour ideas on the lots of very diverse ways to get to the evidence, and then choose like the one that looks the more efficient or the most practical. And we build an action plan. An action plan or a roadmap is basically a list of things that keep on moving, with things to do, places to go, people to talk to. We also make this map of sources. I usually play around a little bit with by drawings and move them around like planets in a galaxy, because I want to know, as the more I know of the characters and the relation to the story and the relation to one another. And so it's another document that we keep feeding and sharing. And at the very beginning, we also want to make a sort of a schedule and see, well, how long will this story possibly take, and what do we need for it? Because as an editor, I need to go to my boss and tell him, well, we will need so much, we will need these, travels and so on. This is probably the hardest part because that's not what we do usually. So there's a couple of things there's one thing that I think is also something we do very little, and which is stop and think. As a reporter, I know that all I want to do is being out on the field reporting, like a goat jumping from hill to hill. But I think we need to stop at times and think about the strategy, and think about how we're conducting things, rethink the process. And the conversations with the editor here are so very crucial in rethinking and assessing what other routes to take. These are the files that I usually suggest we work with. Chronology. This is more like the Anglo-Saxon school of investigative editing. You work a lot. This is something we don't do in Latin America as much, working with chronologies. But what I found amazing is it's this one place where everything is. So it's not only a place where you organize in a chronology and in order the material you're gathering in a very summarized and way, in the way you've already sort of understood something. You've read a document, the reporter has understood it, and he's put it in a document. But it's also a place where everything is. So you don't have things scattered around. Everything that you've got is there in one place. And the amazing thing is that the chronology can be, accompanied by a file, a digital or a physical file of evidence that has that same organization, so you know where things are. And this is important when you're writing. It's horrible to see the suffering of a reporter not knowing where where that, he remembers or she remembers data, an image, a scene, and he just doesn't know where it is. That's absolutely painful. So these documents helped. The other thing is important are reporting. Well, these are a bit boring, and I was very undecisive if to put them here. I usually have long conversations and I take notes, but I see many editors work with memos, writing memos, because it's a way to help reporters start writing very soon in the process. And the memos are basically, it's not just tons and tons of paragraphs, but it's a summary of and an integration of information of what you've learned in the week, on the new questions that have arisen and the ones you've solved. So that's another thing. And the other important instrument is the FOIA Control Center. And all this is just a document where you have all your FOIA requests in order, so that, and all these are shared documents, and all these are living documents. They're all live and changing. And one thing very important here is to be reading and studying these records, because that's a way to keep to be near the reporter, as near as possible to the story, to the heart of it, to be able to produce interesting insights or make better questions to the reporter, or suggestions, reporting suggestions. One other thing that I suggest editors is to also be very organized with our notes about our conversations with reporters, because sometimes reporters lose very valuable pieces of information in the big bucket of things they found, and we can bring them to light, remember them of those scenes, characters that probably got lost in the reporting process. So just collect your pearls, take notes on conversations in one same place.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So many pearls of wisdom already.
Okay, so I won't need this because I do not have a PowerPoint. I actually hate PowerPoint. I really do. So, but I just wanted to quickly say, I want you guys to repeat something after me. Everybody ready? Everybody needs an editor. Everybody needs an editor. Great. Don't care who you are, how great you are, how good your writing is, how great you do as a video producer. Everybody needs an editor. So that's why this panel is really important, and Drew, thank you for coming up with that. First thing I want to talk about in terms of editing is something that we don't do a lot. It's what I call conceptual editing. It's not a new concept for me, but the thing is to sit down and actually talk to the reporters about the story. And when we do this, I have them sit down and we talk through the story, and I have them tell me a story. Because what happens is people start to list facts. And I'm like, I don't want the facts. I want the story. It's just like when you were a kid and your parents told you this bedtime story, once upon a time, and then tell me what the story is. Because it helps you conceptualize where you're actually going with the story. We don't spend enough time actually thinking. You talked about thinking. But on the front end, actually thinking through what that story is and listening and helping guide the reporters as you are going through that process. Because they've done a lot of pre-reporting, so they should have a basic concept. But they've got a bunch of facts, and it's up to you as the editor, as the producer, to draw those things out of them. And I say this, when we talk about editing, we're not just talking about text here. And also, because at the AP, the teams that I run work across platforms. They work in video, they work in audio, they work in online presentations. So it's all editing to me. So everything that I say here applies across the board. The other thing, I always learned as an investigative reporter to write as you go. That was beaten into my head. Like, write as you go, because what you don't want to happen is you do all this reporting, you got the big stack of notebooks that you mentioned, and then at the end of all that reporting, you're sitting there looking at a blank screen, and you're like, oh my God, like, where do I go from here? So you write as you go, but also as an editor, you edit as they go too, because they're sending you drafts, and you're helping to guide those drafts to say, okay, why don't we put this here? Why don't we put that there? Have you thought about this? Because as you go through that writing process and that editing process, you see what you don't have, and you see where the reporting is weak and what you need to bolster that. Once you get into and you've got your drafts and you've got everything there, this a practice that I learned when I worked at the Minneapolis Star Tribune is called line by line editing, and it's exactly what it sounds like. And audio or visual, it's frame by frame. You literally sit there and go line by line. And some of the things that we have taken at least 4 to 5 hours or more to go through, because you're prosecuting every single fact. Like, if you tell me that the person that you're writing about is the mayor of this city, I need to see a document that says this person is the mayor of this city, even if it's common knowledge, because I want you thinking all the time about documenting things, because it's not the big things that will trip you up as a reporter. Right? It's always the little thing. It's always a little thing, and it's what we call the O-rings effect. And so in 1986, the U.S. space shuttle blew up as it lifted off, right? And it blew up because nobody tested the O-rings on the shuttle, because the O-rings they don't work at a certain temperature once it drops. But who checks temperature in Florida, right? Except that one time that it was cold. And the thing blew up because it's the one thing that they overlooked. They tested for everything else. And so whenever I say O-rings, I want you to look at the last thing that you would ever expect that would trip you up, but that's the thing that will trip you up. So that's why we do the line by line editing, because you're going to focus on those big things. You're going to double check those and triple check those. It's the thing that you think you know that you're not going to be as vigilant about. And that, again, will trip you up. And I will say, too, that the other thing that I noticed that you also had here, I have people annotate everything, every document, every interview, because I want to see the context, not just the quote that you've pulled out, not that the thing that you've pulled out of the document, but I also want to see the context. I want to hear the interview. Did you quote this person in context? Did you? And it's not that you're doing it deliberately, but sometimes you just edit something and it's like, well, but that's not the full context of what the person said. So we need to be clear about that. Have you gone through the document to see if you say something here, but later on in the document, do they say something that contradict that? Like, we have to go through the entire thing. So I need to see that as well. We need to go through all of those. And that's why the line-by-line editing takes such a long time. But, I'd rather have that than do a correction or face a lawsuit. Because that may be hard, but it's harder to deal with the correction and to deal with the lawsuits. And I also really preach this to people that less is more. And what I mean by less is more is that you don't have to dump your entire notebook into the story. Right? A lot of investigative, when I was coming up as an investigative reporter, a lot of the stuff is just like, hard news lead, nut graph, bullet point, more big text coming at you. Right? And we can do storytelling. Everything that we talk about is storytelling. I don't care what the story is. It's about the story. We can tell stories. We can write narratives with an investigative face. It doesn't have to be like a true narrative, but we can have narrative elements within things. So less is more, because there's this thing called the internet, right? That you can take the data that you can stick in the story and you can put it in other places, right? The last point that I want to make here is that after the story publishes, we do what we call an after-action report. I was in the military, so anytime there was a battle, you do an after-action report. What did we do correct? What can we do better? I don't ever say what did we do wrong, but what can we do better? And that helps, because the next time we engage in this, it helps us be more efficient. Thank you all. I hope that this was helpful and look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Thank you. Great. Brilliant. Vinod?
Thank you. Can I have a presentation here? Great. I think we at length heard about the different editorial practices, and I just want to take you through the narrative part, and then what can also make an investigative story very compelling, and what is that editors should pay attention. Let me take you through very quickly on this magazine that I started and edited 25 years ago. This was in Malayalam language in South India. That's in terms of number of people, that would be 3 times of the Swedish-speaking people in South. I thought that was far from the Delhi power center, and there won't be any attack or injuries that we would face if we follow investigative work. But we publish a lot of corporate investigations in terms of the shell companies, their contribution to black economy of India, and fake encounter killings, targeted assassinations. And the result was quick. They burned my apartment, they destroyed my certificates. You can see some of the pictures there. We were forced to shut it down 25 years ago. I learned a couple of valuable lessons, and then which I applied again in 2009 when I was instrumental in starting, joining as the editor of the Caravan magazine in India. This was then pitched as the New Yorker of sort, long-form narrative journalism magazine. There was no investigation that we planned at that point. But then, as you can imagine, the political context in India changed very quickly, very rapidly soon after, and there were the legacy organizations who were refusing big investigations, and those stories then eventually will find its way to my newsroom, and then I could not say no to it because I realized the DNA inside me was also an investigator's. But then by the time the form was quite set as narrative journalism, and then we were, big fans of new journalism and new journalism, and so we were finding a way to how do we do investigations in these long 10,000 words, 15,000 word stories, and what aspects of fiction, storytelling skills can you draw into investigations. And that, I think, kind of really shaped in helping the narrative stories with investigation to have like a biting tooth to it. One of the first big investigations that we did was into the Hindu terror networks. And of course, the people came outside the office, burned copies, and we were given police protection and so forth. And now, with every setback, I think what I realized was what was really hurting them was we were taking that investigation and telling a story. And it's not just in the 5W1H style of what is the breaking news is in that investigations, because in a culture where if you really don't have investigative journalism set in, then the readers come to you to listen to a story, to hear a story. So I think that's where you can package the investigation into a story, and it will hurt 2 ways. One, it will hurt the people who really want to hide it, that this new information is out. Plus also a lot of young readers who really don't care for what has been, whether you're advancing a reporting, because they haven't even followed what the previous story is. So you are getting an additional audience. I realized that in Instagram and with audience under 25, you are grooming them, you are getting them on board with your investigations. Many of these investigations that we've done, let's say, which can be slightly boring, the death of a judge. Now this judge would have put the right-hand man of Prime Minister Modi in jail in series of fake encounters, targeted assassinations. The Chief Justice himself offered a $15 million bribe to the judge, who refused to take it, and then the judge dies. And we do a series of investigations after that, 30 follow-up stories and so forth. Now, because we were focusing on the narratives, and we were for the first time then at that point targeting judiciary, and in most democracies, journalists are told you can't touch judiciary critically and certainly not talk about corruption in judiciary. But then this kind of opened a Watergate of major issues in the country at that point. With for the first time, 4 collegiate judges, the topmost 4 judges, came out in a press conference raising the stories in the caravan, and also the pressure that judiciary is facing from the executive. So what would have just written as a crime story, then with a story on the backdrop, on the context of how pressured the judiciary is and how that pressure works, had a bigger story. And then a series of big investigations on the Chief Justices on the Supreme Court, High Judiciary then followed. Yeah, of course, this had consequences. There were a number of cases. I also faced 10 sedition cases in different parts of the country, destroying peace, all kinds of issues, of course, that you can imagine. Just to come to the 2 different tracks that I want to sort of, I tell this to my colleagues, and both in the reporting side as well as in the editing side, because I think editing starts when, as you said, as soon as you sort of focus on a story idea and you develop that story. The editor doesn't come into picture once the draft is filed. The editor comes into the picture once the story idea gets discussed. And at that point onwards, I see there are 2 kind of tracks that you can lay down. There is the story track, and there is the investigation of the content track. Let's look at the investigation of content track. So from selecting an idea to the literature review or whatever has been done so far, to finding what context that this story gets told, and if there are specialized comprehensive knowledge, let's say in story of science or financial crime that a corporation is doing, there is a bit of a technical specialization that not normally all editors are not aware of, or the reporters are. So we sort of spend some time to learn that, to familiarize with ourselves with the landscape. And then the actual reporting, and then of course with the reporting there is that investigation too. This is what I broadly call the content track or the investigation track. Then you add a story track to that, which is that you're going there as also as a storyteller. So you need to look for hints of characters. How does somebody behave? How does somebody talk? How does somebody sit? What are the mannerisms that you can observe? And scenes get to the scenes. If let's say Prime Minister, so and so, in a group, in a meeting, was talking to somebody else, then you really want to slow down there and then get the context. What time of the day it was, where they're standing, where they're sitting. These kind of aspects of scene creation and setting the scenes, you'll later realize when you sit down to edit the story, you can really make miracles with those material that what you can collect through the reporting. And the emotional experience that if people have gone through, let's say the death of the judge, for example, we were, through the family, we were telling the stories of how he would come back home and what pressure that he would be under and how he would convey that pressure. And so that the emotional experience is very important too. Metaphors and the narrative arc. The narrative arc is basically the beginning, middle, and end, as we know all the grandmother's stories that we have all familiarized with. So yes, that's it. So story track plus investigation or content track, I think, will make good investigative journalism. And editor, of course, pushes, widens the horizons, and that's and then also wear 3 hats: the journalist, the writer, and the scholar. Thank you.
Only three hats. Thank you, everybody. As you can see, I want to give a big shout out to GIJN for organising, not just putting this panel on, but also bringing 4 amazing editors here up on stage who've all provided an amazing amount of tips.